Hello and good morning, everybody. It's me, Julian, and today I would like to talk about what Slavoj Žižek characterizes as the fine art of non-thinking, which is basically his argument against what you might call popular wisdom, like stoic quotations, Marcus Aurelius, don't talk about what it means to be a man, simply go out and be one, etc. And their ideological correlatives, namely figures such as Jordan Peterson or even Andrew Tate, books that sell really well, that teach you life lessons derived from the great thinkers, etc. Essentially the reduction of philosophy to common sense aphorisms and maxims. That's Žižek's target. And he characterizes this as the fine art of non-thinking. Why? Because basically this thought essentially serves to conceal its opposite, not thinking. As long as we express ourselves by means of quotations, etc., we don't have to actually think. We don't actually have to do the reading. We can simply satisfy ourselves with the quote, but we don't have to read the book. Moreover, Žižek's argument is that the contemporary capitalist subject, who is free but only nominally so, doesn't really think for himself. He simply retweets and shares these images that, in their supposed universal common sense, nevertheless hide or obfuscate deep ideological messages about how the world should be, normative expressions. Instead, for Žižek, thought, in its most basic form, should be that which makes us critique or question the world around us. Thought should not integrate us into the world, thinking, well, that's profound, I think I agree with this. Instead, thought should make us think, wait a minute, why? This makes no sense. We should be confounded by thought. This is the Socratic definition of philosophical thought, that philosophy begins as soon as you refuse to accept what exists as given. A popular quotation, on the other hand, or word art in a mall, a pillow emblazoned with the words "live your best life," serves to integrate you into your social surroundings, into the symbolic order. And Žižek's argument is that the massive proliferation of this type of popular aphorism is a key symptom of capitalist participation. We don't know what to think, but we feel like we ought to be expressing ourselves. And so we fall back upon universal maxims that seem to express thought and yet do the very opposite. They are expressions of non-thought, what Žižek calls the fine art of non-thinking. In fact, in his book, Sex and the Failed Absolute, he puts this quite concisely. He says, "The true enemy of the present book is what one is tempted to call the fine art of non-thinking, an art which more and more pervades our public space. Wisdom instead of thinking proper. Wisdom in the guise of one-liners intended to fascinate us with their fake depth." And then he concludes, to skip a section, "Therein resides the ideological function of word art wisdoms. While word art presents itself as a safe haven, a retreat from the madness of capitalist hyperactivity, in reality, it makes us the best participants in the game. We are taught to maintain the inner peace of not thinking." And this inner peace of not thinking is how the subject can essentially consume aphorisms and deep thoughts, but he never actually has to in any way challenge himself or think critically about his surroundings. In this sense, aphorisms and what Žižek calls word art are supposed to make us more complacent, are supposed to make us feel more integrated into our capitalist surroundings. And the irony is that the tradition of quotations and aphorisms is radically against this. Like Karl Kraus, the Austrian aphorist and journalist, wrote hundreds and hundreds of pages of deeply philosophical and witty intellectual aphorisms, like "to have no illusions, this is where illusions begin," or "even or precisely dwarves cast long shadows," the title of this book. A wonderful aphorism about writing that he has is that writing is easy the less one does of it, and becomes harder the more one does of it, etc. The art of the aphorism is that it's supposed to complicate a seeming cliche. It's supposed to turn it on its head. Whereas what we have today are essentially cliches, reified capitalist thought, that therein represent political slogans and commercial slogans, advertising, essentially. And Žižek is also referencing tacitly Alain Badiou, the French philosopher. Alain Badiou, in his second manifesto for philosophy, wrote that the real danger isn't that philosophy disappears. Instead, the real danger is that it disappears because it becomes so universal, like the philosophy of coffee, the philosophy of dogs, etc. Even John Gray recently released the philosophy of cats, which would be a prime example of this. And these books sell really, really well because, of course, they work as commodities. They're easily digestible. They make good gifts. They might make you laugh in the moment. The application of philosophy in its most neutered sense to the most universal of subjects, the philosophy of cats, is therefore the very death or antithesis of philosophy. And this is what Alabaju warns us against. This is also very Hegelian, I should say. Hegel was perhaps the philosopher par excellence who was anti-wisdom. Hegel thought that philosophy could never be reduced to a punchline or an aphorism. In this sense, he was very different from Nietzsche, who was perhaps the aphorist in chief. Nietzsche loved aphorisms and used them very effectively in his philosophical writings. I should also say personally, I'm a great lover and aficionado of aphorisms and the tradition thereof. But it's important to note that part of Žižek's not just Freudian slip, part of Hegel's argument against the aphorism was a general tendency to be disinclined towards the Romantics, and the Romantics loved their aphorisms. And Hegel very much did not like this, hence why he wrote very lengthy, difficult tracts that could never be reduced to an aphorism. And the aphorisms that Hegel has, these simplifications like substance equals subject or spirit as a bone, are almost anti-aphorisms in that they are completely confounding unless you are already a Hegelian scholar. And so Hegel's argument is that philosophy ends the moment it becomes reduced to an aphorism, and philosophy begins as soon as one has to go all the way through it. Ironically, the way in which Hegel is taught today is precisely by means of aphorisms that don't really reflect his thinking, at least not in their most apparent guise. Like the owl of Minerva takes flight only at dusk is an aphorism of sorts, and yet it's a very difficult one that requires a great deal of study in order to properly comprehend it. Hegel therefore uses the aphorism against itself, which makes him a very intriguing thinker. But I'd like to conclude here with Žižek's argument. If the fine art of not thinking is sharing stoic quotations online, etc., then what is the antidote to this? Like, what is the actionable, to use an ideological mode of expression, what is the actionable way in which we can practice actual thinking instead of non-thinking? Well, it's quite simple. The expression and the identification of quotations as the fine art of non-thinking is itself a form of true thinking. It's the critical reflection upon the social space in which we live and participate. In other words, Žižek's basic argument is that to critique is to practice true thought. To instead see something and see oneself affirmed in it is the opposite of thought. And so essentially, if you take a step back, if you think critically about your surroundings, about the underlying structures and mechanisms, the quote-unquote power structures, as it were, the incentive structures that facilitate the predominant mode of popular discourse and exchange, this constitutes true thought. And then if you want to have the appropriate concepts to help you think about this, you can read the primary texts. Now, Karl Kraus has an aphorism about this. He says, true thought is thought which doesn't add on to itself, but which multiplies itself. In other words, it's not one thought and then another thought, like the infinite scrolling of stoic maxims that serve as self-help wisdoms about how you can get ahead in life. Instead, true thought multiplies itself. You read a text and you have spontaneous ideas that appear to be completely new, things that you could only think against the backdrop of the thinking that you were reading. For example, if I read an essay by Borges, it's impossible for me not to have at least 5 different ideas that seem to spontaneously emerge from the reading as such. And making these types of connections, this aliveness, this alive quality of thought is what actual thought looks like. Thought which multiplies itself. And therefore, you could ask yourself a very simple question. Does this thought speak for itself? In other words, do I consume it and I'm satisfied and I move on to the next thing? That is not thought. That is simply a truism, a common sense thing. But if something sticks with you and makes you think other things, and suddenly you start making connections between books and movies and poetry and literature and politics, that's when you have a true thought. A true thought can't be contained. It might be reduced, but it multiplies itself. That is what true thought looks like. And so to end on a binary of sorts, an aphorism of anti-aphorisms, true thought is that which multiplies itself. That would be my word of wisdom to you today. Thank you for listening, and I will see you tomorrow And please do consider becoming a patron, as there is a lot of extra content behind the scenes, including a weekly seminar in which I answer your questions and discuss them with you, as well as my recurring ebook subscription, which releases a new ebook every 3 months, and the latest text is titled The Silence of the Drives. I will see you tomorrow.